How's it guys? I love the square format in photography. I think it is one of the most versatile aspect ratios that you have. It is literally capable of doing anything. But unless you kind of know how to use it properly, it can be a little bit sort of tricky to get your head around. And certainly when I started taking photographs way back when I was wanting to be a professional photographer, so I went off to photo school and took my trusty Canon A1 with me. And up until this point, I'd only ever photographed in 35mm. And going there to Pretoria, I had an opportunity to finally get my hands on some of the more kind of expensive kit. There was a room there where you could go and sign out equipment and you could get Rolleiflexes, Mamirs, Hasselblads, and there were all the lenses to go with them. And the very first time that I picked up, I think it was a Hasselblad. I'd like to think it was a Hasselblad. And I looked down through the ground glass and it was like a magic world had opened up to me. All of a sudden, it felt professional. I think that was the main thing, that I felt that somehow photographing square was more out of the realm of the amateur. Of course, this was prior to Instagram and all of those things. So the fact that I was using a square format made the photographs feel off the bat inherently different to everything else that I've been doing before. But of course, with that came a lot of challenges. I had gotten used to composing in certain ways and putting things off to one of the sides in my images, especially landscape photographs. And the square format gave real challenges that I struggled with initially, despite the fact that I kind of went, hey, I'm looking like a pro here because I'm photographing square. A lot of the images to start with were not really making the best use of the format. It was more just, okay, well, I don't have a wider space to photograph in, so I'm just going to compress everything into the middle. But over time, I got better. I understood what was working and what wasn't working. I would look at other photographers and see how they composed images. Richard Avedon, he did wonderful photographs. And at the time, I think Andy Gotts was also just getting started. So I would see his images in, I think it was Practical Photographer, when he was photographing Stephen Fry, and take note from these. And of course, then you had also people like David Bailey. I was a massive fan of David Bailey back in the day. And you can look at his images, take examples of what works and what doesn't work. And I was learning the whole time, bringing these things, people were sharing ideas with us. And all the while, I was getting a chance to photograph day in and day out with any square formatted camera that I wanted to use. So it was a wonderful learning process. And over time, I did get better at composing. Now to the point where I actually almost photograph everything that I do on a personal level in a square format. It used to be a lot trickier. I did used to have to go and buy film for my Holga, my trusty old Holga. Unfortunately, my Hasselblad and all that kind of stuff, that's drifted away over the years. And then I bought one of those 5DS that said, oh, you can crop square inside. And I thought, this is brilliant. This is going to be what an awesome thing to have. And then you find out that it's not actually cropping square in the viewfinder. It's just giving you a pre-cropped square image in RAW, which, okay, that's still square, but it's not quite the same as natively photographing in square. That magic of the ground glass, looking through a viewfinder and seeing, well, the world in a 1x1, in a little box. And that little box is something that we can play around with. There's a huge amount of strength that I discovered when I was experimenting with the square format that didn't really necessarily replicate into 35mm. Things like leading lines, diagonally squiffy little S lines going into the frame work so much better in a square format. diagonal lines are really powerful. I feel that in 35mm, they can often lose a little bit of their impact, but in one to one, in that square format, they are so powerful that you can create what in 35mm would feel like a completely unbalanced composition, something all higgledy-piggledy. But in square format, it seems to work. That if you place something in a 35mm frame, center, with nothing else around it, it feels a bit lost. It feels just kind of, there's too much space on the sides. But do the same thing in square format, and it becomes such a tighter composition that everything is focused on that one thing, and it just feels right. I don't know about you, but I often get this idea when I'm looking at photographs that something feels right, or it doesn't feel right. There's a very odd feeling. I don't know if there's an explanation for that, maybe gut instinct. When you look at your photographs, when I look at my photographs in 35, and then sometimes I crop them into square, then I go, well, that feels better. But the problem with cropping into square is that you aren't really thinking about it at the time when you're taking the image. It's one thing to, go out and take some photographs and then put them on the screen and then crop them into square formats, which is something I used to do in between having access to all those expensive, medium format square cameras, and then finally getting a Holga or something. There was the wilderness years where I had I think it was a Canon 650D, and I would crop that into squares. And you don't, because you're not photographing in square, because you're not thinking about it, it's a very different process. It's a bit like kind of, sort of trying to process an image afterwards to try and save it. Cropping a thing into square is not really, it's just, for some reason, it doesn't fit right with me, that it doesn't seem to work the same way as if you have something, a viewfinder, a camera that does photograph natively square. And I think it is that thing of it's coming down to the viewfinder, the way that you look at the world through the viewfinder. So I tried all the processing things and, cropping it in square. Then I got my Holga, and that was a nice, cheap way of getting into the square format, of reconnecting with it. And certainly that was no doubt one of the best investments I have made in my photography. It wasn't just the fact that I was able to photograph square, but also that because it is such a low-brow, low-tech piece of equipment, I mean, it is literally a piece of plastic, that it took away so many of the options also from the photography, worrying about the f-stops and the apertures and the shutter speeds and the ISOs. Of course, f-stops and apertures are both the same thing, he says, but of course now somebody's going to say in the comments below, Alex, I think you're wrong, you'll find there's a difference. But it was liberating to go back to a format that I loved, to revisit photographing native square images without also having to worry about taking exposure readings. Because with the Hasselblad, they're not automatic. There was a 205 TCC, I think, when I was a student, that had a built-in meter, some of them, but all the blacks that I used were completely manual. None of them had any sort of metering attached to them. It was all incident metering stuff, and I loved it, but it slowed you down, and it made another aspect of the things to think about, because I was a poor student. I didn't have money to buy infinite rolls of 120 film and then expose them badly. So I had to take my time and make sure things were correct, because there's nothing worse than a really thin, horrible negative. So, getting there, taking the Holga, revisiting it, and then because Instagram came along and they chose to use square format images, and I believe they chose to do this because it was making first of all, the app stand out from all the other image sharing apps at the time. Also, it was easier to curate a uniform home screen when all the images are the same ratio. So people were starting to, experiment with squares and check things out and stuff. And I thought, no, this is kind of cool. But then I think like a lot of photographers, especially at the beginning of Instagram, I kind of went, oh, it's all about food, and it's the hipster kind of types who they don't really care about photography. So I didn't really think about it too much. Of course, that's all changed subsequently. It's just one of those things. It has shown its worth. And I think it's great that it introduced people to square format. Of course, the flip side of that is that there were people who were just kind of going, I don't want to photograph in square. I don't want to be restricted to having to present my images in a certain ratio. And I understand that. I get that. It's less of an impact for me because I went, I like squares. So that's cool. But you may have found that having a square was restrictive. So, sitting there, Instagram comes along, and then of course Instagram was so popular. Again, I believe that when the iPhone was released, it didn't have a square format for shooting with. And then they introduced one. So that's great for me now because I can natively photograph square without lugging around a medium format camera and all that kind of stuff. And if you are thinking about experimenting with square format images and actually photographing in square rather than cropping it later on, what a great idea to go in there in your phone, getting that. I love that. It was such a blessing for me because I just adore photographing images that can have weirdly off-balanced compositions where you can place things in the center of the frame and they look great, of using diagonal lines, of not having to rely on lenses and things of that nature to really exaggerate an image. And that's an interesting point. I loved this idea that when I photographed square, when I used to put on like a 40mm lens, which on a medium format is quite wide, it's like a 28, I think, equivalent 24, that it didn't have the same effect, didn't distort the same way. It just gave you more view. And I loved that. It was interesting, but it did, of course, take away one of the things that I liked, which was distorting views using a 28mm lens and getting up close to things. So I had to find other ways of making that image have a certain weirdness, quirkiness. So I would do odd crops, go in really close, tops of people's heads, having them look off to the side. I started off, everything was always kind of looking direct at the camera, but over time we became more confident with taking pictures, that I was photographing lots of, for want of a better word, fine art images, and having the person look to the short side of the frame. Because these rules that apparently that we're breaking all the time, they're not really rules. They're nothing that people want to sit and will go, you must do this. It's only camera club judges who say these things. Out in the real world, with commercial photography and with art, sort of buyers and things, they don't really care about the rules. They just, does the photograph work? Does it move them? So when using square, you'll come across, there's all the sort of things. And when I was, looking about researching this video, I found an interesting, two videos actually, where one of them talked about having the image in the center of the frame. That was a no-no, that you shouldn't do that in square photography, in that 1-to-1 ratio, that you should put the subject off to one side. Otherwise, it's a static, boring composition. And then on another website, it says you should put everything in the center of the frame because it leads to a harmonious look and a feel to the photograph. And you could, if you need a reason why that photographs they shouldn't be bound by rules, there you have it in a nutshell, in a box, as it were, that there's always people giving you advice. The beauty about the square is that we aren't so tied up. I'm certainly not so tied up about all the gunk that's built up in my head over time about compositions and S-curves. We talk about S-curves, golden ratios and all the things that people love to talk about when it comes to composition. It's more what feels right for me. Do I put something center? That kind of cool. That works pretty cool. Can I get down really low? Yep, that also works pretty cool. Can I photograph things on a Dutch angle or Dutch tilt, depending on however you want to say it? Yes, I can. Can I do strange crops? Yes, I can. They look, to me, more interesting, more dynamic almost. And that growth, the ability to have the access to those cameras, the medium formats, and learning to see the world in a square way was such a wonderful passage in photography that I would heartily suggest that I would other people to experience that, to not be afraid of the square format. For some reason, you talk to people a little bit and they get all at 6s and 7s about the square format, and I get it. It's different, especially when you are photographing with, say, a medium format camera, where the whole process, if you're not used to it, is very different to photographing with a digital camera or something like a Holga. So go out there, check it out, see what the world has to offer you in square. Even if it is something, if you're using like a back, the fold-out LED screens on your camera, you could mask out part of it so it was a square and use that as a benefit. Use your phone, shoot on the square format that's embedded into them. If you really have to, crop your images square, but photograph with the intent that it needs to be square. I mentioned Andy Gotts earlier and his fantastic portraiture. Go and check it out over here if you want to see an expert at work with the square format. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I will see you again soon.